Buenos dias, ohayo gozaimasu, and good morning everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Professor Alfonso Ferreiro for inviting me as a guest speaker to the second international workshop for the Eurasian Humanism Research Group at the University of Salamanca. The title of this presentation is Japanese Philosophy and the Idea of Eurasia, a Transversal Theory of Knowledge. I'd like to talk about this topic in 4 parts: Preamble, the Idea of Eurasia, Kyoto School and Tanabe, and concluding questions. So without further ado, let's get started with the first section. In the preamble, I'd like to give you an outline of this lecture. First, briefly, I'd like to actually talk about the current situation in Asia, just to give you an idea of where I come from and why I'm actually sending you a video instead of coming to University of Salamanca and deliver this lecture in person. Second, I would like to talk about the idea of Eurasia, since the main topic of this conference is to do a research and workshop in the topic of Eurasia. So let's talk about the idea of Eurasia from the context of philosophy. And also finally, my specialization is comparative and Japanese philosophy. Therefore, I'd like to actually give you Japanese philosophical conception of transversal knowledge or theory of knowledge that actually helps us understand the idea of Eurasia. So before moving on, I'd like to give you a brief account on my current situation in Asia. Most people don't know where I work. So when I say I worked at the Sun Yat-sen University at Zhuhai campus in China, people ask, where in China, right? So I show them the map. So the Zhuhai is located right next to Hong Kong and Macau. It is a southern province called the Guangdong province. The capital of the Guangdong is Guangzhou, right here. And Zhuhai is located right here, right next to Macau. Now, there is a famous bridge that comes from Hong Kong, Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, the 55 kilometers over the ocean. So these 3 regions are pretty close to each other. Also, a famous city is called Shenzhen. Zhuhai and Shenzhen are considered to be the special economic districts, or special economic regions, in these area. And then Macau and Hong Kong are famous for being special administrative region. Zhuhai is unlike any other cities in Guangdong province. It's very small. It's just located next to Macau, very new city. And Sun Yat-sen University has 5 campuses, 3 in Guangzhou, 1 in Shenzhen, and another one in Zhuhai. So I do work at the Sun Yat-sen University Zhuhai campus since September 2019. Since I moved to Zhuhai, many things happened, just to say the least. Just to give you an idea, I'll just give you my personal experience. I was scheduled to give a talk on Tanabe and his logical species at the first Pearl River Region workshop on modern East Asian philosophy somewhere around September or October. Now, because of the situation in Hong Kong, it was pushed back to November, and then things didn't get better, so we decided to cancel this talk. Now, another conference on Kyoto School was about to take place in October. I think it was October in Hong Kong, and for the same reason, they canceled it and then moved the conference to Taiwan in February 22nd. At the National University of Taiwan. They invited me to give a talk. So here we go. I have a talk that I haven't given, and I'm just suddenly invited to give a talk in Taiwan. So I said, okay, I'll come and give a talk. And because of the situation in East Asia, this conference was also canceled. And so, one topic that I was supposed to give at the one workshop twice were canceled. And then I was supposed to give the same talk at another conference, which was canceled once, was also canceled. And this is a completely personal experience, but I have in-laws in Belgium, Europe. So a week and a half before the Chinese New Year break, I decided to come to Belgium and to stay with my fiancée and her families. After 10 or 12 days in Belgium, this outbreak of coronavirus in Wuhan took place. Therefore, I was not able to go back to China. And then the situation in Japan started to take place. And therefore, I will not be able to travel back to Japan, or it's not advisable to travel back to Japan at this moment. And also because of the situation in Japan, there are many travel bans over East Asian citizens. So I wasn't sure I'll be able to actually come to the University of Salamanca to give this lecture in person. So I decided to actually record this lecture and deliver it to you via YouTube. So that's the current situation in Asia. So you have a Hong Kong situation, epidemic, and Japan, Korea, etc. I think we are going through some dramatic event that might mark the turning point in the history of East Asia. So we have to actually put that in the background when we talk about this Eurasia in this workshop. Now, the second, I would like to talk about the idea of Eurasia, and then I'd like to talk about Japanese philosophy, but more specifically Kyoto School. In relation to the Kyoto School, I specialize in this thinker called Tanabe Hajime. So I would like to give you a taste of Tanabean philosophy as a framework in which we can think about this transversal knowledge that gives us a kind of methodological implications to the ways in which we can do Eurasian studies. The study of Eurasia. The term Eurasia is a combination of two words, Europe and Asia. In Japanese, sometimes we call it Owa. This is described in Japanese as kabango. And I was wondering why in the world we call this phrase that we combine two words, kabango. That is because it is originally called in English as portmanteau. Portmanteau is actually a bag. It's a brand that describes this kind of bag that folds in the middle. So you open the bag in the middle, you throw your luggage, and you close together. So portmanteau is a word to describe a phrase or word that consists of more than one word or one phrase. So Eurasia is a combination of Europe and Asia. Therefore, you put these two concepts together. So necessarily, it implies some kind of fusion. But the term fusion could have very good connotations or bad connotations. And bad connotations for me personally is like confusion or fusion restaurants, right? When somebody wants to take you to the Asian fusion restaurants, I would just say, oh, thank you, but no thank you, right? So fusion could have very negative connotations because there are different ways in which we can think about putting two things or multiple things together. First, it could actually imply just simple amalgamation. So when I pack my luggage to go to conferences, my fiance always makes fun of me for putting all these luggage just nonchalantly, just close the suitcase and just go. Amalgamation would be a combination of multiple different concepts of different methodologies combining together without really combining. So putting together without really combining, it's a kind of summation. It is quantitative summation in a sense. So the Europe studies takes place in this region, in this method, and Asian studies takes place in this region, in this method. At the end, we get together and talk about it, but there's no methodological implications on either side. There's a simple amalgamation of data that we collected from exercising Euro-Asian studies. So that would be a negative ways in which we can talk about this fusion of Europe and Asia in Eurasian studies. Of course, by putting two things together, it immediately implies some kind of unity. Even amalgamation implies unity. Let's say European studies and Japanese studies taking place separately. When we talk about unity, there has to be some kind of methodological unity or some kind of the unit by which we can actually evaluate their findings. Also, by putting two things, sometimes we could highlight or emphasize this unity. So even if you put the Europe and Asia into the one bag, you immediately recognize the disparity of the size, right? The Europe and Asia is 60% of the world population. Europe is 15% or something like that, right? So when we talk about the size or the quantity of data that we have to even gather from Asian studies and European studies, would have to be some kind of disparity. But then when you look at the Department of Asian Studies and Department of European Studies, sometimes European Studies is much bigger in the European universities. So you do have this kind of disunity once you put two different concepts together in this fusion. Also in philosophy, we talk about this transformation. When you put two things together, there's mutual implications. So let's say European studies and Asian studies are put together in the same room. The ways in which we conduct European studies affect the ways in which we study Asia in Asian studies and vice versa. So there's a kind of mutual transformation or mutual implications once we put two concepts together into one framework. Now, in the context of philosophy, sometimes we talk about two different ways in which we can put these transformative intermediation. One is open transformation, or the other one is closed transformation. Sometimes we talk about the open one as a positive transformation and the closed one as negative transformation. Tanabe definitely talks about this language of open-closed, which comes from Bergson's concept of open and closed society. So open transformation is something like the ways in which we conduct European studies affects the ways in which we do Asian studies, but Asian studies has its own methodology as well. So there's open intermediations and open transformation of two different distinct ways in which we study Europe and Asia. So it's easy to think about this sort of intermediation between two frameworks of thinking or frameworks of studying the geopolitical regions with this open transformation. But of course, the closed negative transformation takes place all the time. The closed negative transformation is something like this. So there's European studies and Asian studies, and then the specialists of both camps talk to each other, but they talk to each other in such way that they can only have this conversation insofar as that conversation benefits their own methodology. So the European specialist comes in and talk with the Asian studies specialist, but they want to hear about things that only prove their own theories or methodology. So there's a kind of dialogue between multiple different disciplines, but dialogue takes place only insofar as one framework of thinking can win over. So there's a self-affirming self-determination of one discipline over against all the others. So there are intermediations and dialogues among multiple disciplines, but the closed transformation tends to focus on one framework. So there is not so much transformation, but it's a kind of sublation of other disciplines into your own, to affirm your own methodology. So whichever position of fusion you take, so let's say study of Eurasia is a simple amalgamation of different data that we get from European and Asian studies, or it is a kind of unity or disunity of two different disciplines, or we are going to talk about transformation of the ways in which we do European and Asian studies by implementing Eurasian studies. It is very important to talk about interdisciplinarity. So whatever position you take in relation to this notion of Eurasia, we have to talk about interdisciplinary studies. So in the following, I would like to give you a philosophical account of intermediation between multiple disciplines and show you how it has enormous implications to the methodology of interdisciplinary studies and how it actually affects our idea of Eurasia or the study of Eurasia. That takes us to the third section of Kyoto School and Tanabe. And in this section, I'd like to introduce Tanabean philosophy and his transversal theory of knowledge. Now, when you talk about Kyoto School, the most famous thinker is Nishida Kitaro. He's not only the co-founding member of the Kyoto School, but also known as the father of modern Japanese philosophy. His works are both philosophically and historically significant in relation to the contemporary intellectual history of Japan. Because of this, there are a great number of scholars working on the works of Nishida, and also many translations and commentaries on his works are available in European languages, including English and Spanish. Tanabe Hajime is much less known than Nishida. This does not mean, however, that his works are less significant. In fact, because of the rise of Tanabean philosophy, many great thinkers say that the Kyoto School came to be. If Nishida was the only important thinkers from the Kyoto School, we only have a Nishidian schools of thought. But because of the Tanabean critique of Nishida, we came to have a variety of different ways in which we can talk about comparative and Japanese philosophy. So the significance of the Kyoto School also comes with the significance of Tanabean philosophy. Now, Tanabe Hajime published many works just like Nishida, and the complete works of Tanabe consists of 15 volumes. In the context of Tanabean philosophy, I would like to actually introduce his theory of knowledge, specifically in relation to the single article written in the midst of 1930s. The title of the article is called The Two Aspects of Education in Natural Science. This paper was originally delivered as a lecture at the workshop on the study of Japanese culture instruction, hosted by the Department of Ideology at the Ministry of Education in November 1936. It was later published as an article in Japanese Culture series by the same department in the following year. The political and cultural climate at the time was the nightmare of the totalitarian state. It was rather aggressively trying to justify the development of natural sciences in consonance with the right-wing nationalism, or what Japanese political historians would called The Rise of Japonism or Tennocentrism. Now, Tanabe clearly indicates that the purpose of this workshop was to talk about how the education of natural science should contribute to the political claim that the emperor should be the state sovereign rather than a branch of government. There was a breach of political power and a cultural judgment in the domain of natural science at the time in 1930s. This is the worst time. So if you see any movies that talk about 1930s Japan, you always see these military officers doing some cruel stuff to the POWs. It's just a nightmare. It's the worst picture of Japan that you can actually deliver to the world. It's just to pay attention to the 1930s and early 1940s. It is obvious that Tanabe was actually invited to this workshop as the leading professor of philosophy at one of the prestigious national university. And of course, he was invited to praise what government was doing and also how natural science was trying to comply with government policies. But I think philosopher was not going to do this lip service to the government Ministry of Education, but he was actually trying to make a point about the theory of knowledge. Now, it's very important to understand we cannot talk about Tanabe's theory of knowledge without talking about his theory of religion or philosophy of religion or metaphysics, in whichever form you would like to talk about it. This is called metanoesis. Meta literally means in the midst of and beyond. So something in the bottom or foundation of knowing as well as what exceeds knowing is a metanoesis. Sometimes Tanabe talks about it as a conversion or metaphysical framework that shifts from one point to another. But this is a very foundational framework of thinking that Tanabe actually develops in 1930s and 1940s and onwards. So we have to actually pay attention to the metanoesis as a background, and then we will talk about cross-noesis. It is the kind of process of knowing that crisscrosses the boundaries between one academic discipline to another or one ways of knowing reality to another. So we will briefly pay attention to what Tanabe does with the notion of metanoesis, or just to give you a historical and a cultural context in which he came up with these concepts, and move on to the cross-noesis to talk about how Tanabean theory of knowledge contributes to a very specific understanding of interdisciplinary studies and how that affects our understanding of interdisciplinary study of Eurasia. Tanabean metaphysics and social ontology. Tanabe has published a series of essays called Logic of Species between 1930s up until 1945. This is where he started to criticize Nishida and differentiated his own position from his predecessor. So this is where he started to cultivate his own original contribution to the history of philosophy. They amount to 2 volumes in the complete works, and they consist of 1,200 pages. Now, what is really interesting about this is that Tanabe thinks this is incomplete. He was asked to publish it as a monograph by his students and colleagues and even famous publishers. But even though it actually marks the origin of Tanabean philosophy, the philosopher himself is actually not content with what he has done here, and then he moves on to develop his later philosophy of religion from 1946 onwards. Logic of Species first talks about social ontology, which talks about the freedom of the individuals and authority of the state. So how can we actually make sense of the division between singular and a community of the singulars? So he talks about social ontology, but because of the nature of the work is so abstract, he started to talk about methodology of philosophy. So it starts to become more metaphysical and even more closer to the philosophy of religion as he develops his own theory. Now, he could not complete the Logic of Species, so he came up with a new way of doing philosophy, which is called Philosophy as a Metanoetics, published in 1946. 懺悔道としての哲学 in Japanese. It was translated twice into English, once in early 1990s, and then recently in 2016, it was retranslated again and published. Philosophy as Metanoetics talks about this conversion of a philosophical framework from the previous self-centered way of thinking to self-negating way of thinking. And it places the absolute in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the concept of nothingness. So he takes this nothingness from Mahayana Buddhist tradition and puts as the foundation of metaphysical thinking, and also incorporates the Pure Land Shin Buddhist tradition, where they talk about other power. So the absolute as the great self-negating other power that grounds the reality and the self-power of all things. In that process of coming up with the metanoetic philosophy, he talks about theory of knowledge in 1936. So I would like to actually call it metanoetic interdisciplinarity. Again, in the essays, Two Aspects of Education in Natural Science, Tanabe talks about the contrast or the intermediation between natural science on one hand and what is other. So in the context of 1936, you can immediately see the breach of cultural and political consensus over the practice of natural sciences, right? So the state is asking you as a philosopher to talk about how education of natural science should be done in consonance with the propaganda that we should make the Japanese emperor as a sovereign of the state. In this context, Tanabe is just talking about the relationship between natural science and the rest of the disciplines, but the ways in which Tanabe talks about these intermediations between natural science and its others has ample implications into the interrelationship between one academic discipline and another. So there are strong interdisciplinary implications or methodological implications to the interdisciplinary study in this essay is quite prominent. Now, it's very helpful to think about how we conceive of interdisciplinary studies today in academia to really understand what Tanabe is trying to do in this essay. So in the following, I would like to briefly describe how interdisciplinary studies is described or conceived in contemporary academia and how Tanabe criticizes it and differentiates his proposal from this regular understanding of interdisciplinary study. To make things easier, I'd like to actually change the background to white for a diagram. Usually when we think about interdisciplinary studies, we think about them in terms of Venn diagram. So one discipline, let's say philosophy, is represented by a single circle. So this red circle represents philosophy. And then you have another discipline, let's say Japanese studies or Asian studies, right? So if you study Japanese philosophy or Asian philosophy, you'll tend to go for this interdisciplinary approach. So you have red as philosophy and blue as Asian or Japanese studies. So interdisciplinary studies in this context is somewhere in between, right? So the topic that falls within the context of both Japanese studies and philosophy would be considered as Japanese philosophy. So interdisciplinary studies of Japanese philosophy. Anyway, these circle could be anything, right? So you could have one discipline on the left, another discipline on the right, or it could be more than two circles. But each circle represents a single discipline. And of course, these circles are dynamic. So sometimes Japanese studies and Asian studies in the European academic context is booming, right? So you have more programs that are started to pay attention to what's actually going on in Asia. And then Department of Philosophy is downsizing everywhere, right? So less and less people are interested in philosophy, and more people are interested in East Asian and Japanese studies, for instance. So the interdisciplinary area also changes because these circles are dynamic. Now, Tanabe is saying that this common way of understanding interdisciplinary studies is problematic, and in fact, it is a misconception. So what is metanoetic interdisciplinarity? In this essay, Tanabe talks about two ways in which we can think about the interrelations between multiple disciplines. The first he calls is a setchu, or what we can translate here as negative compromise. And an ordinary picture of interdisciplinary studies that we saw with the Venn diagram is precisely this kind of negative compromise, according to Tanabe. So for instance, if you have one circle representing philosophy and another circle representing Asian studies, and we are going to conduct an interdisciplinary study, what happens to this Venn diagram approach is that we can only look at the set of questions that are pertinent to both of these disciplines, and also the discussion concerning the shared object of study would have to remain comprehensible to both of these camps all the time. In this sense, we would have to make a compromise. And we could also suffer from a fusion restaurant effect, where we claim to integrate different ingredients and diverse culinary techniques, but the dish could turn out to be superficial and offensive to anybody who knows any of the specific culinary traditions very well. In opposed to this notion of setchu as negative compromise, Tanabe talks about shichu from the classical notion of taking the middle from the doctrine of the mean. Shichu is basically the ways in which you can intermediate between two different perspectives without compromising one perspective over the other. Tanabe talks about this in a context of quantum physics. In quantum physics, Max Planck, for instance, talk about this mutually exclusive complementarity. In the context of quantum physics, they talk about the nature of light or electrons, and there is the famous conflict between particle and wave theories. So if you take one perspective of particle theories or wave theories, you cannot accept the other perspective. One perspective always denies the possibility of the other. What does mutually exclusive complementarity does is to say that these two conflicting perspectives are accurately depicting the contradictory nature of reality. Tanabe described this with the classical Confucian terminology of shichu to say what we need for talking about interdisciplinary studies is a mutually exclusive complementarity. That is to say, each discipline should be treated with equal dignity and respect. So to say that the philosophy is losing popularity and there are more need and popularity among the Asian studies does not mean that we should actually look down upon philosophers and then we should focus on Asian studies, or the other way around. Or sometimes philosophers could be pedantic and condescending toward other disciplines by saying that the philosopher is in charge of theoretical frameworks in which we can think about many things, right? So it's very important that the mutually exclusive complementarity guarantees that each discipline should be treated equally, and also each discipline should be autonomous. So for instance, common understanding of interdisciplinary studies, that you could have a conversation with specialists from other fields insofar as what you're going to say is in line with methodology of other disciplines. So that your conversation cannot be beyond the confines of the other disciplines. And that is quite problematic. It actually requires you to compromise your own autonomy. In this framework of a metanoetic interdisciplinarity, autonomy of each discipline is very important. Because of this, we have to acknowledge the radical differences between different disciplines, and through that difference, we can actually guarantee the excellence of each scholarship. And finally, it would have to constitute a decentralized network of different disciplines. So if we use the example of Japanese philosophy as interdisciplinary study of Japanese studies and philosophy from the previous example, when specialists of philosophy and a specialist of Japanese studies look at the Japanese intellectual text, or it doesn't have to be Japanese studies specialists, they could be historians. So let's say there's a philosopher and a historian looking at the one historical text from Japan. The philosopher can talk about it insofar as it actually contribute to the discussion of the historians. Historians can talk about the text to the extent that he can make himself understood by philosophers. That suffers from negative compromise, where our research would suffer from mediocrity. It becomes a kind of conversation that everybody can understand, but it's not very meaningful for each disciplines. Mutually exclusive complementarity guarantees that each specialist should do the investigation to the fullest. So the philosopher should look at the historical text as a philosophical text through and through, and historians should look at the text as a historical text. That is to say, some of the discourse that the philosopher would provide would become incomprehensible to the historians and vice versa, but that is okay according to Tanabe. Metanoetic interdisciplinarity has to provide a place in which each discipline can do its own job to the maximum degree. Decentralized network of different studies is to guarantee that each discipline actually focus on what is significant for that discipline, and through that it recognizes the limits of each investigations, and through that recognition of limit we will be able to actually intermediate between one discipline and another. So this is metanoetic interdisciplinarity, or metanoetic transversal theory of knowledge, that actually has implications in interdisciplinary studies of Eurasia. So if we apply this metanoetic transversal theory of knowledge to our study of Eurasia, or that is to say, we should actually conduct research in the area of Eurasia by respecting each discipline to have its own autonomy and full examination. I don't think that would eliminate all possible questions. I think we will be confronted with a number of different problems, and that can lead to different ways in which we would have to actually conduct the study of Eurasia. So in the concluding section, I would like to actually talk about some questions that are left unanswered at the end of this lecture. So concluding questions. First, I would like to talk about the the question of how can we account for the whole without the other? That's the first question. So we're going to study Europe and Asia in the context of Eurasian studies. But what about other disciplines or other geopolitical regions like Africa? Don't you think that the African perception of Europe and Asia would affect the ways in which we actually present ourselves, or the ways in which we understand ourselves? Does that completely segregate it from the perspective from Africa? Or immigration issues in European context would alone require transversal knowledge that goes beyond the Eurasia. So is it possible for us to actually study the Eurasia without taking into account other regions of the world? It's not only Africa, we have to think about Polynesia. For instance, Polynesian studies is actually quite remarkably important for the study of Japanese philosophy. Recently, I'm investigating some Japanese mythology. The conventional framework of understanding Japanese mythology is that everything came from the west to east and stayed in Japan. But there are many elements in Japanese Shinto traditions that have implications of the mutual influences between Polynesian and Japanese mythological components. So, accurate description of Japanese mythology in the context of Japanese studies itself require some sort of Polynesian influences. If you want to talk about a certain area of Asia, we have to incorporate a certain perspective from outside. So to study anything in the context of academia, we have to actually always take into account what it lies beyond its own framework. So if we want to have a comprehensive study of Eurasia, you have to have a comprehensive study of the world. So my question is, where do we actually stop to expand this Eurasia to something like study of the world? Also, the second question is this: how do we avoid the rampant tendency towards specialization? I'm not showing you this beautiful picture of dog with fake glasses looking at himself on the magazine, right? The point of this picture is something like this. It's the glass that we put on as academics. Well, there's a famous saying that you miss the forest by paying attention to the single tree, right? But we have this tendency to pay attention to the single leaf, right? As a specialist of philosophy, I'm a specialist of philosophy of religion. I'm a specialist of philosophy of religion in relation to the works of Mahayana Buddhism. In relation to Mahayana Buddhism, I pay attention to Japanese Buddhism, witch Buddhism, so on and so forth. So it's almost like all of us are driven to pay attention to the single dew on the single leaf in the tree. That is, might not be from the same tree, and then we're missing the whole forest. So once we have this tendency to account for the autonomy of each disciplines and enable each discipline to engage in its own discourse in its own right, and then let it actually examine its subject to the maximum degree, we have this tendency to specialize to the point nobody really understands what you're talking about. So how do we actually avoid this problematic tendency toward specialization while accommodating metanoetic interdisciplinarity? The final question is this: how can we proceed while accounting for the long line of Eurocentrism? Now, in European academia, it's quite clear that the number of institutions that study what belongs to the European intellectual tradition is much more than the number of institutions that actually study what belongs to the Asian intellectual traditions. I mean, the sheer quantitative inequality between Europe and Asia is clear. So I'm assuming that your department is actually interested in expanding the research beyond the European studies and entering into the Asian studies, and then trying to do the interdisciplinary study between European and Asia. But the tendency for Eurocentrism within the context of European academia is of course quite large. I mean, if you want to talk about Eurocentrism, come to philosophy department and ask them if they teach anything that is non-Western. It's most likely that they have one course on Asian philosophical tradition, which somehow includes all the traditions of the Asia into the one course. Or maybe your philosophy department doesn't even have a philosophy course that is on non-Western intellectual tradition. So we do have this problem of centralizing the relationship between Europe and Asia from the side of Europe. So we do have to actually pay attention to that. So how do we actually account for this openness between two different disciplines? Also, this Eurocentrism or any kinds of centrism has a tendency to actually suppress the voice of the individual or the voice of the minority. So we do have to actually make sure that we don't end up erasing these voices of the individual and the voices of minority, to make sure to actually reflect what's going on in both in Europe and Asia, or if we are going to actually conduct the Eurasia in the way Tanabe proposed, we have to actually make sure that these intermediations between European and Asian studies, or the concept of Europe and Asia, will not end up sacrificing these single individual and minorities. Otherwise, it would go back to the same problem of one-sided, transformative, closed intermediations between multiple disciplines. So the three questions that we will still have to ask, even if we adapt Tanabean notion of interdisciplinarity to our study of Eurasia: 1, how can we account for the whole without the other? 2, how do we avoid the rampant tendency towards specialization? And 3, how can we proceed while accounting for the long line of Eurocentrism? On that note, I'd like to finish my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to receiving your comments, and I hope to see you in the future.